Hey, welcome everyone. I am Michelle Ellis, PRSA Colorado Chapter President, and I am very excited today to introduce you to our brand new Chapter Chat Live series. And joining us for our inaugural edition is Jeremy Story. I don't really think I need to introduce him. My guess is that you all know who he is, but in case you don't, Jeremy is the Vice President of GroundFloor Media, and he is the producer of the Denver PR blog, which if you have not signed up to receive, you should do so today. To tell you a little bit about what these Chapter Chat Lives are going to be, just brief conversations with PRSA Colorado leaders, with leading communicators in our market. Jeremy is one of those individuals who keeps his finger on the pulse of everything that is going on in public relations. Makes sense since he puts out the blog. So I thought today would be a great time for us to just chat briefly. Should we do it?
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks for having me. I'm feeling a lot of pressure with the first one here. If there's not a second one, I'm going to feel like I'm to blame.
I'll make sure I schedule a second one. Right.
No matter what, a second one has to happen. It could be their problem if there's not a third.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have PR hits and misses every year. Do you think in 2020 we saw more than our fair share?
Actually, I think 2020 was a great year to have a PR disaster because there was so much going on that it will, obscure the fact that bad things happened. There's nothing like a pandemic to give you a little bit of air cover when things go wrong.
That is true. Absolutely. Usually you have to release crisis news on Friday at 4 p.m. to get buried. Yeah. And with the pandemic and a presidential campaign, it was pretty easy to avoid some of that coverage.
Yeah, definitely. So any day of the week became Friday at 4 p.m. just with the pandemic and everybody checking out and the challenges that everyone was having, trying to balance their professional lives and their personal lives and homeschooling and whatever else was going on. So my guess is that people will remember the 2020 disasters much less than they will some of the other years when there was nothing to really hide it.
But that being said, not everyone was able to escape crisis this year.
That's right. And in some cases, it was the pandemic that caused them. And, one of the ones that I included in my annual list of the 2020 PR disasters was Tyson Foods. And they actually had a situation where they had some managers at a plant of theirs that were wagering on how many people who had to work the front lines would get sick. And it was really some craven stuff. And it came out because of a lawsuit that they were involved in. But that's a situation where, unfortunately, big food production companies like that were really at the forefront of some of the COVID cases because those people had to work to create, to continue the food chain. And as a result of working side by side the way they do on those lines, the production lines, they were really susceptible to transmitting the virus. And it was just brutal. And we saw that locally with JBS, but Tyson really became the face of that because that wagering scandal that became news in the fall, it went national. It was everywhere, and it was really embarrassing for the company.
Well, and then to add insult to injury, Tyson published an alarming full-page ad in the New York Times where they declared that the food supply chain is breaking, which led into people worrying, going out and buying meat, not quite to the same degree they were buying toilet paper earlier in the pandemic, but they definitely created some alarm with that as well.
Yeah, really, there's no way better to create a run on something than to claim that there might be a shortage. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You announce that there could be a shortage, which causes panic, which actually creates that shortage. So it's a frustrating challenge, and Tyson and others, learned that they had to be a little careful about doing that.
Beyond just talking about the headline, let's chat about, especially when we're looking at Tyson and JBS, what were some of the things that these crises had in common? I think one thing you and I discussed before was this shows that I think they did not consider employee communications and making sure that their employees were getting appropriate messages.
Yeah, I think that's true. One of the universal truths about communications, unfortunately, is that oftentimes employees are treated as an afterthought.
Yes.
There is an expectation among senior executives that because employees draw a paycheck, that you have bought their loyalty. And that's simply not true. And there is no better brand ambassador for a company than its employees. When they're out in the community talking with their friends and neighbors, they share what the brand of the company is. And unfortunately, with Tyson and JBS, what you saw is a lack of respect for employees. They were willing to not treat them as well as they should have, and communications was certainly part of that. But I think you also saw it in the work environment, access to personal protective equipment, and just the requirements that they stand side by side on those lines without the appropriate precautions. So the one thing I think that people can take away from those situations is that you need to treat employees well, and that includes the communications aspect of it. If you treat employees like a valued audience the same way you treat other stakeholders, that can go a long way toward getting employees to buy in, and they'll be more productive, they'll be happier, and they'll also speak well of you out in the community.
One thing that intrigued me watching both of those situations unfold is that when a crisis situation happens, companies do have an opportunity to respond. We are very forgiving. I think in both of these cases, we saw a lack of appropriate and timely response, and they really continued to not control the message.
Yeah, I think that's true. That the capacity of the American public for forgiveness is enormous, and there's almost no situation where a company cannot come back from it if they show that they are genuinely contrite and that they've taken steps to improve the situation and make sure it doesn't happen again. It is amazing to me. That's one of the things that I counsel our clients on, is that you've got to handle it the right way, and if you're fearful for doing that because you think you're going to draw more attention and that the devastation is going to last longer, nothing could be further from the truth. It is just shocking to me, the companies that make a comeback. Sometimes it takes a couple of years, but I am always amazed at how quickly companies come back from bad situations if they handle it correctly.
Yeah. So if you were counseling them in 2021, what do you think they need to do to build that trust back with their employees and with the public?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that they really need to do is have somebody at the C-level who is empowered to look out for the employees. Because again, the communications is part of it, but this is bigger than just a communications problem. This is an employee treatment problem. And just the lack of respect that they showed their employees by putting them through those conditions and being so cavalier about it, and to the point that they were betting and joking about how many of their employees were going to be sick, it's incredibly disheartening, and it's a sign of a culture that has gone awry. So, the first thing I would want to do is to put somebody in a position of authority at the C-level whose job it is to, advocate on behalf of those employees. And it's a bit of a road back. I mean, you're not going to flip a switch and suddenly everyone's going to trust you. But over time, if you continue to do right by those employees, they'll recognize it and they will speak about it. And people, and customers included, will start to recognize that you're behaving differently. And, if you can even get yourself in a position where you're leading the industry and how you're treating your employees, you will be the face of that, and people will recognize what a difference it has been, and that you took this opportunity where bad things happen to step up and try to improve the situation and truly take steps that empowered your employees. I think the community and your customers will respect that.
Well, let's go into another one where we're talking about a company who has struggled with crisis, and it's like they're just not getting the message. Wells Fargo continued to have some challenges in 2020.
Yeah, they did. And they have had almost annually, they're starting to become Subway, where it's, set your clock.
Yeah.
Once a year, they're going to have a pretty big scandal. And with Wells Fargo, you're talking about people's financial situation. And that's obviously has a lot more gravity than just making sandwiches for people. This year, their CEO, after several years where they were caught up in a scandal and paid a $1 billion penalty for illegally signing up their customers for services they didn't request, and they specifically targeted targeted elderly customers who they felt would be less likely to notice, and therefore it would be a more successful scam. That wasn't company sanctioned, but some of their employees were doing that. They finally seemingly got past that, and then their CEO was caught, blaming their lack of diversity in the workforce on just no good candidates of color. And obviously, in our hypersensitized environment right now, that wasn't going to play well. It wouldn't have played well anytime, but especially this year. And there they are, sort of, back to square one, trying to build this reputation and rehabilitate it. And yet, these self-inflicted wounds that they keep creating are preventing them from moving forward. It's just amazing that a company that large and historically that well respected could continue to find itself in a situation like that.
I mean, do you think this is an example of top-down issues?
Yeah, it's pretty clear that there had created a culture that valued profit over caring for the customers.
Yeah.
And in fact, that lack of diversity, ironically, at the C-level, I think, can also cause them to have even bigger blind spots. And they managed to walk into one of those giant blind spots, and their CEO really paid the price for that, and the company as a whole too.
Yeah, I see that they have named Barry Rafferty to head their corporate communications, and then they hired the former Obama chief of staff William Daley to lead public affairs. So they're going to have a big job this year, aren't they?
Yeah, they certainly are. And the question will be how much authority they give those new hires to try to look at things differently. So, time will tell how well they do, but it's clear that they have at least recognized that there is a problem, whether they feel like they can just superficially address that or whether they've hired people who are empowered to dig deep and figure out how to help change a culture. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. So we've addressed a couple of misses. Let's end on a positive note.
Sure.
What were some of, you would call some of the bigger PR hits from 2020?
Yeah, a few of them. I mean, healthcare workers, I think we would have to put front and center. They really bared the brunt of the pandemic, and their expertise was really needed. And the environment that they were working in was really frightening. I mean, there was no way for them to be socially distant in the nature of the job. And perhaps the face of that really was Dr. Anthony Fauci, working first for the Trump administration and now for the Biden administration. They've even talked about a bit of what they call a Fauci effect, where people were inspired by him and they have seen a dramatic increase in the number of applications to medical school. So when you look at who had a good year, a lot of times you want to look at what change came about because of them. And that dramatic increase in medical school applications is something that we as a society can only benefit from, certainly.
Yeah. Well, and I have to give a shout out to the healthcare workers as well. Not just the work they're doing, the way they, as individuals, were communicating with us on social media. They really stepped outside of themselves to share stories so that people could understand and see the crisis firsthand, things that their companies maybe weren't even asking. And I think now as we're entering vaccinations, to me, it's incredible seeing healthcare workers go out there as well with a positive message, get vaccinated. They're showing us pictures of themselves as they're doing it. And they continue to play such a critical role.
Yeah, they do. And social media was really an interesting one because you saw a lot of reporters, Chris Vanderveen at 9 News and others who wanted access to understand what it was like on the front lines. And healthcare providers weren't always comfortable with that. There are a lot of regulatory reasons, HIPAA and others, that you have to be very careful. And, general counsels were certainly concerned about the liability of things. So finding that equilibrium where you could share some perspective of what it was like on the front lines through social, but also balance the needs of the institutions was interesting.
Yeah. Okay, we have to end on Dolly. Who doesn't love Dolly?
Yeah, Dolly Parton had a great 2020, and it's one of those things where there are a couple of obvious reasons and then a couple of just chaos theory reasons. Dolly Parton, I grew up in the 80s, and Dolly Parton was just a country singer, and she was a bit of an eccentric one. And I don't know that people kind of fully appreciated her, but over time, I think history has started to judge her as, a really powerful music industry person. And 2020, it seemed like that kind of came together, and people began to really respect the legacy that she had created. And then, as a quirk of fate, she made $1 million donation to try to help fight COVID, and she invested it on the side of trying to find a vaccine, and that money went to help find the Moderna vaccine. And so it was a bit of an eccentric Dolly kind of thing that suddenly she would be tied to a COVID-19 vaccine. So she's always been a terrific person. I don't think anyone would ever argue that. When you look through the history of what she's done, and even her quirky things like founding Dollywood were really about a jobs program for her hometown, Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, that was in dire need of help, and so she did that, and her whole career has been about helping other people along the way, and I think 2020 was just a year where we started to really appreciate good people, because there was a sense that we could use some good news.
And I hope we see a lot more in 2021.
Indeed, yes, please.
Okay, I could talk with you all day, but we have promised to keep these chats brief. So I want to thank you so much for your time. To everyone watching, we will share a link to Jeremy's full list of 2020 PR hits and misses. We'll share a link on our blog, and we'll also upload the video if you weren't able to join us live. Thank you so much for your time today, Jeremy. We really appreciate you.
My pleasure, Michelle. Always great to spend time with you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And if you want to learn more about the chapter, don't hesitate to visit our site at PRSAcolorado.org. Thank you. Have a great day.